Hello, guys. So this has reached the point of absurdity. I've been stalling, finishing up these two sermons I gave you to read, and you'd think the amount of time now that they've dominated our class, they've been like the most important things ever. No, I've been stalling just because I wanted to talk to you guys about a few things about them before we moved on. But then just stuff keeps coming up, and I haven't been there. And now there's some training they want me to go to. So I'm going to go ahead and record what I wanted to say about these to finish it up. And I'm sorry that's not nearly as good as an actual back and forth conversation. But we did have the message board. If you had any questions about that stuff, we can address those there. But I want to just point out a couple of things in these two documents and why they are historically important before we move on to our next document, next piece of literature. So anyway, this one, Model of Christian Charity, as I told you when I first introduced it to you, is a sermon that was delivered on the Arabella as it crossed the Atlantic. And it is really laying out Winthrop's vision for their colony in the New World. And he was really looking at it as a new world. Of course, there's all sorts of European assumptions in that, thinking that it's like, oh, people are already living there, tough for them. But anyway, it's a brand new world to these Puritans, right? They think that they're going to establish a special kind of community. And we can see that in the way he talks about it. You know, in here he's saying we have to set the example for the world. And that's going to be how we're going to inspire future generations. And he's also warning them, hey, if we don't do what's right, if we don't follow the commandments of our God in this new world, then we will be used by the enemies of God as an example of, oh, look, they were so holy, supposedly, and look how they turned out. So that's how he's trying to really set them up as an example. Now, in this is a very famous line, which you have probably heard before. Well, I don't know. You should have heard before in history class. You've probably heard it. He says, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill." He's saying that this new community that they're establishing, people are going to look up to it for an example. And the reason I always like to dwell on that line and talk about it a little bit is because some people would say this right here is the beginning of an important part of American mythology called American exceptionalism. We've talked about the myth of the American dream before, and again, as I always like to note, when I say myth, I don't mean something that isn't true. I mean a story that has power to a particular culture. So it's an explanatory story. It tells us about who we are. And so there are a couple of these myths that are kind of sacred to America. And this is one of them, this idea of American exceptionalism. You know, you always have politicians get up and say, America is the greatest country on earth. And that may seem perfectly normal to us as Americans, but Finnish politicians don't routinely get up and say Finland is the greatest country on earth, although maybe they have some claims to it. You know, New Zealand is the greatest country on earth. No, they don't do that really. So it's this idea of America is special, and it's an idea that's not just important to Americans. You know, it's why America continues to be a beacon to immigrants and things like that. So it's this part of the American mythos, and some people would say this is where it starts. This idea that Winthrop is putting up there, that this new community they're going to found is going to be special, because the Puritans, while the specific religious sects that were the Puritans have kind of faded away, or been absorbed, or kind of evolved and changed in different ways. The Puritans still had a really big influence on later American culture from New England, and then it spreads out. And so this is part of that influence. So that's what I really wanted to point out to you with a model of Christian charity, is how that idea of American exceptionalism is kind of in its nascent form here in this sermon. Now, I also had you read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is just a fun sermon. I mean, it seems fun to me, but of course he was deadly serious about this. This is part of the theology of Jonathan Edwards, and it's some of the theology here he shares with the Puritans. There's a lot of emphasis in this sermon on the Old Testament wrathful God. And the key idea here that they share is the idea of original sin, which is pretty central to most Christian theologies. But the idea of original sin is that from the fall from grace in the Garden of Evil, all human beings are inherently sinful. This is a central idea in the theology of both the Puritans and the Great Awakening here of Jonathan Edwards. So in the way he's describing how we are all worthy of hell in this speech, he really is very much in line with the Puritans. He's saying we are all sinful and we are so far beneath God that we deserve nothing but hell. So the key point here is that no human being can deserve to be saved from hell. It is only God's grace that saves us from hell, according to this theology, right? Now, the big difference here from the Puritans, it comes in the last part of this excerpt, where he starts talking about how to save yourself. And he says, you have to accept Jesus. You have to be born again, and then you can be saved. You have to, kind of accept God's grace. Now, this is different than the Puritans, because the Puritan answer to what can I do to be saved is nothing. The Puritans believed in predestination, like some other Christian sects and Protestant sects, like the Calvinists. They believed in predestination. So what that meant was that God knows exactly who is going to be saved at the end of their lives in the end times. He knows. It's like he's got a list, and it's set, and there's nothing you can do to change it. So now some people would say, well, then I can do whatever I want. I'm just going to, God knows, you don't know. And so, of course, obviously, if you're living an outwardly sinful life, you're not on the list. So it's kind of like you're trying to live up to what you hope is your destiny in God's plan. Because obviously, if you're not living a religious life, you're not on the list, and you're definitely going to hell. So that's a big difference from Edwards. Edwards is arguing for being born again, whereas model of Christian charity, the Puritans, they believed that special destiny was theirs alone. And if you were a member of the elect, you were getting into heaven. And if you weren't, too bad for you. So that's a big theological difference between these two passages. Okay, so those are the two things I really wanted to point out to you in these two passages. And of course, I won't bore you more by staring at these screens, but I wanted you to be aware of these. Like I said, they're important historical texts, important parts of American literature, and important influences on American culture. So we'll put a bow on these guys and move on. And the next thing I want to read with you is Benjamin Franklin's Autobiography. Not the whole book, although it is an interesting book. It's actually made in two parts. One of them, he was just writing letters to his son about his life. And then once somebody suggested he publish it, he started turning it into more of a book. And so it's really a kind of an oddly MPD, multiple personality book, because it kind of shifts halfway through. But it's been seen as a very valuable record of early American history and of the life of a very influential American figure. And there's actually a fun activity I want to do with you guys with it. So if you go into Schoology, you'll find a copy of just, again, a short excerpt from Benjamin Franklin's Autobiography. So please read that. And we will talk about it and actually do something with it next time. Won't just be read this and for a week we'll wait to talk about it like this time. So sorry about the delay in getting to talk about these two passages. And you guys have a great day, and I will see you next time, hopefully for sure.